The evening was quiet. Jeffrey sat at the kitchen table, staring at a book, his fingers occasionally turning the pages out of habit rather than interest. He couldn't focus. The air was thick with tension, but neither he nor Angela acknowledged it. From the living room, the sound of Angela's typing was a steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that filled the house. Jeffrey glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, yet Angela showed no signs of winding down. She was absorbed in her laptop, her eyes fixed on the screen, her fingers moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with him. He knew what she was doing. It wasn't work, it was something else, something that had been eating away at him for months. Angela's voice cut through the silence, startling him. "Are you coming to bed soon?" she asked, her tone light, but with an edge that didn't go unnoticed. Jeffrey looked up, meeting her gaze for a split second before forcing a smile. "In a bit," he replied, his voice calm, betraying nothing of the turmoil inside him. He watched as she turned back to her screen, the glow illuminating her face. A face he once loved without question, now a mask hiding lies. He had known for a while now. The signs were all there, the late nights, the sudden attention to her appearance, the coldness in her touch. But the confirmation had come one night when she left her phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked. A message from her boss, Patrick. A message that changed everything. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Maybe you can wear that little red dress I love so much. Your husband doesn't appreciate you like I do. He's clueless, just like we planned." Jeffrey had read the message twice, each word cutting deeper than the last. But instead of confronting her, he buried his anger deep inside, masking it with a facade of normalcy. He played the role of the unsuspecting husband perfectly, while in his mind, he crafted his plan, a plan that would make them both pay. As the night wore on, the tension in the house became palpable. Angela closed her laptop and stood up, stretching. "I'm going to get ready," she said casually, as if this were any other night. "All right," Jeffrey replied, watching her as she walked up the stairs. His eyes lingered on her for a moment before he turned back to his book, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but think about the times they used to be happy, really happy. Their life had been picture perfect, or so he had thought. But somewhere along the line, things had changed. Angela had changed. Or maybe he had just been too blind to see it. The love they once shared had withered, replaced by something hollow and toxic. Jeffrey got up from the table and walked over to the kitchen sink, staring out the window into the darkness. The perfect suburban street lay before him, with its neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses. It was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened, at least not on the surface. He heard Angela coming down the stairs and turned around. She was dressed to kill, in the little red dress he had seen in that text. The one Patrick loved. Jeffrey's blood boiled, but he kept his face neutral. "How do I look?" she asked, twirling slightly, her eyes not really seeking his approval. "Beautiful," Jeffrey said, his voice steady, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. She smiled, satisfied with his response, and grabbed her purse. "We should go. Don't want to be late." Jeffrey nodded and followed her out the door, locking the house behind them. As they walked to the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. He had prepared for this night for weeks, but now that it was here, a part of him felt an almost surreal detachment, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. The drive to the party was silent. Angela was lost in her thoughts, probably thinking about Patrick and what the night would bring. Jeffrey, on the other hand, was focused on the task ahead. He had gone over his plan 1,000 times in his head, making sure everything would go off without a hitch. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back control, about making them pay for what they had done to him. Jeffrey's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Angela sat beside him, adjusting the strap of her red dress, a dress he recognized all too well from the message he had read. It clung to her in a way that would have once made his heart race, but now only served to fuel his anger. "Are you looking forward to the party?" Angela asked, her voice a little too casual, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Should be fun," Jeffrey replied, his tone flat, betraying nothing. Angela glanced at him, sensing the undercurrent of tension, but saying nothing. They continued in silence, the distance between them feeling vast despite the physical closeness. They arrived at the venue, a large, upscale hotel where Patrick was hosting his company's annual party. The parking lot was full of luxury cars, a testament to the wealth and power Patrick wielded. Jeffrey parked the car and turned off the engine, taking a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "Ready?" Angela asked, her voice filled with a false cheeriness that made Jeffrey's skin crawl. "Ready," he replied, opening his door and stepping out into the cool night air. They walked into the hotel together, arm in arm, the picture of a perfect couple. But beneath the surface, Jeffrey was seething. As they entered the grand ballroom, filled with people dressed to impress, he scanned the room, looking for Patrick. Angela's arm looped through Jeffrey's in a gesture that felt more like a formality than an expression of affection. The doors opened to reveal a room full of people, all laughing and talking, their voices blending with the soft jazz playing in the background. The scent of expensive perfume and cologne mingled with the aroma of hors d'oeuvres being passed around by waiters in crisp white shirts. Jeffrey recognized many of the faces, colleagues and their spouses, people he had shared drinks with at previous company events. Tonight, though, they were nothing more than unwitting participants in the drama about to unfold. His eyes scanned the room, quickly locating Patrick, who was at the center of a group of people, holding court like a king surrounded by his loyal subjects. Patrick's presence was hard to miss. It didn't take long to spot him. Patrick was at the center of a group of people, laughing and holding court like the king of the world. He was tall, handsome, and exuded confidence, the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted. And tonight, Jeffrey was going to take it all away from him. "Let's grab a drink," Angela suggested, already heading toward the bar. Jeffrey followed her, his eyes never leaving Patrick. He watched as Patrick noticed them and excused himself from the group, making his way over with a smug smile on his face. As Jeffrey and Angela approached, Jeffrey noticed the subtle shift in Angela's demeanor. She became more animated, her smile more genuine, as if being in Patrick's presence revitalized her. Jeffrey's stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had a role to play tonight, and he couldn't afford to lose his composure. Patrick spotted them and grinned, his teeth gleaming in the soft light. He spread his arms wide in a gesture of exaggerated warmth. "Jeffrey, Angela, so glad you could make it." His eyes lingered on Angela, the look in them unmistakable, though he quickly masked it with a friendly grin directed at Jeffrey. "Patrick," Jeffrey greeted him with a nod, his voice even. "This place is impressive." "Wouldn't miss it," Jeffrey replied, forcing a smile. Patrick chuckled, clapping Jeffrey on the back a little too hard. "Perks of being the boss, right? I've been thinking we should get together more often. You and Angela are such a lovely couple." Jeffrey forced a smile. "That sounds like a great idea." Patrick turned to Angela, his eyes lingering on her a little too long. "You look stunning as always," he said, ignoring Jeffrey completely. "Thanks, Patrick," Angela replied, her smile genuine, a smile she hadn't shown Jeffrey in a long time. Jeffrey's hand tightened around his glass, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was all part of the plan. He just had to bide his time. Jessica, who had been engaged in conversation with another guest, turned her attention to them, her smile warm and genuine. "It's so nice to see you both," she said, her voice smooth and pleasant. "Angela, that dress is stunning." "Thank you, Jessica," Angela replied, returning the compliment with a smile that seemed too bright. As the evening progressed, Jeffrey played the part of the attentive husband, but his focus was on Patrick and Angela. He watched as their hands brushed briefly when they reached for the same appetizer, as they exchanged knowing smiles when they thought no one was looking. Patrick was the picture of charm, effortlessly balancing conversations with his guests while stealing glances at Angela whenever he could. The familiarity between them was sickening, but it only solidified Jeffrey's determination. At one point, when Patrick was momentarily alone, Jeffrey seized the opportunity. He approached him with a drink in hand, offering it to Patrick with a smile. "Here's to a successful night," Jeffrey said, raising his glass. Patrick grinned and clinked his glass against Jeffrey's. "I'll drink to that. This company's going places, and it's all thanks to the great team we've built." Jeffrey nodded, taking a sip. Speaking of the team, I wanted to talk to you about something. There's been some chatter in the office. Nothing major, just some concerns about the direction we're heading. Patrick's smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. Concerns? What kind of concerns? Just the usual, Jeffrey replied smoothly. But I thought it might be good to get ahead of it. Maybe a meeting with the higher-ups, a chance to address any issues directly. Patrick's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered Jeffrey's words. I see what you mean. We can't afford to let any doubts fester. Let's schedule something next week. Sounds good, Jeffrey agreed, his tone casual. But inside, he was seething. He knew Patrick would dismiss the concerns as trivial, just as he dismissed everything else that didn't serve his interests. As the night wore on, Jeffrey's anger simmered beneath the surface. Every laugh, every shared look between Patrick and Angela felt like a knife twisting in his gut. But he kept his emotions in check, waiting for the right moment. He needed to be patient. He had planned this night meticulously, and he wasn't about to let his anger ruin everything. The night had settled into that familiar, late-hour lull. The music was softer, the laughter quieter, and the guests had begun to pair off or cluster in small groups, lost in their private conversations. Jeffrey stood at the edge of the garden, sipping on his drink, watching. He'd been waiting for this moment, letting the alcohol work its magic on the crowd, loosening tongues and lowering guards. It was time. He saw Patrick and Angela slip away from the main gathering, their bodies angled toward each other as they moved to a secluded corner of the garden. Patrick's hand brushed the small of Angela's back, a gesture so intimate it made Jeffrey's blood boil, yet he forced himself to stay composed. This was not a moment for anger. This was a moment for precision. Jeffrey set his glass down on a nearby table and followed them, his steps measured, purposeful. The gravel crunched softly under his feet, and he could see them now, standing close together under the dim light of the garden lanterns. Patrick was saying something, his voice low and smooth, and Angela was laughing, a sound that once would have brought Jeffrey joy, but now felt like a dagger to the heart. Patrick was the first to notice Jeffrey's approach. He turned, a lazy, mocking smile spreading across his face. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour. Enjoying the party, Jeffrey came to a stop just a few feet from them, his eyes flicking from Patrick to Angela, who quickly looked away, her expression tense. Jeffrey replied, his voice steady. But I think it's time we clear the air. Angela's posture changed. She stiffened, her fingers twisting nervously around the stem of the wine glass she held. Patrick, however, seemed to relish the challenge. He leaned back slightly, a smirk playing on his lips. Oh, and what would that be about? Jeffrey took a step closer, narrowing the distance between them. He kept his voice low, forcing them to lean in slightly, their attention focused entirely on him. I know everything, he said, enunciating each word with deliberate calm. The late nights, the secret meetings, the lies. I know what you've been doing behind my back. Patrick's smirk widened, his arrogance blinding him to the danger in Jeffrey's eyes. Is that so? And what are you going to do about it, Jeffrey? Run to HR? Get a divorce? Come on, man, you're out of your league here. Listen, loser. I've been doing your wife for years. She prefers my Big Johnson than yours. Right, babe? And you know what? Your kids are also mine. You idiot didn't even notice. Jeffrey's lips curled into a smirk of his own, a gesture so devoid of humor it sent a shiver down Angela's spine. Actually, I was thinking something a bit more dramatic. For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed Patrick's face, his confidence wavering as he searched Jeffrey's expression for a clue. But Jeffrey offered him nothing, turning instead to Angela, who was now visibly trembling, her facade cracking under the pressure. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. I've been patient, but now it's time to end this. Angela's face drained of color, her eyes wide as she looked up at him, words failing her. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jeffrey cut her off with a glance, so cold it froze her in place. He turned back to Patrick, who was now frowning, his bravado starting to unravel. You think you're untouchable, Patrick? That you can take whatever you want without consequences? Patrick straightened, attempting to regain his composure. What are you talking about? Jeffrey took a slow, deep breath, savoring the moment. He'd been waiting for this, the perfect line to set the stage for what was to come. Just like I did with your wife, huh? The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Patrick's expression faltered, his smirk fading as the meaning of Jeffrey's statement began to sink in. He blinked, trying to process the implication, but it was Angela's sharp gasp that confirmed his worst fears. She stared at Jeffrey, her hand flying to her mouth in shock, while Patrick's face went ashen, his usual swagger replaced by a look of dawning horror. "You're lying," Patrick said, but there was no conviction in his voice. It was more of a plea than a statement, his bravado crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. Jeffrey stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression cool, detached. "Am I?" he asked. "We got a surprise for you." Letting the question linger, unchallenged. He watched as the doubt in Patrick's eyes grew, the cracks in his confidence widening with each passing second. And then, as if on cue, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, their sound growing louder and more distinct. The noise sliced through the quiet garden, cutting off the muted conversations of the other guests. Heads turned, whispers spread, and a ripple of unease began to move through the crowd. Patrick's eyes widened, his face draining of color as he turned towards the sound. The wail of the sirens grew closer, more ominous, and the realization that he had trapped began to settle over him like a heavy fog. The confidence that had fueled his arrogance all night was now replaced by a gnawing panic. Angela looked from Jeffrey to Patrick, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Jeffrey, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jeffrey didn't answer her directly. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on Patrick, who was now visibly sweating, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. "I warned you, Patrick," Jeffrey said evenly. "I told you there would be consequences." The sirens were nearly upon them now, the flashing lights reflecting off the manicured hedges surrounding the garden. The guests began to murmur among themselves, some moving towards the front of the mansion to see what was happening, others exchanging worried glances. Patrick's bravado had completely dissolved. He looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route, but found none. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. "There's no way you could have." Jeffrey cut him off, his voice low but firm. "You thought you were untouchable, Patrick, that you could take whatever you wanted, destroy lives without a second thought. But you underestimated me." The first police car pulled up to the entrance of the mansion, its red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the lawn. The guests began to scatter, confusion and fear rippling through the crowd as more officers arrived, stepping out of their vehicles with purposeful strides. Patrick turned back to Jeffrey, his face now pale and drawn. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "You can't do this." Jeffrey stepped closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "I can, and I have. You're going to pay for everything you've done, Patrick. You and Angela." Angela recoiled as if struck, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jeffrey, please, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Jeffrey replied, his tone icy. "I understand that you both thought you could make a fool out of me, that you could carry on your little affair without any consequences. But you were wrong." The police officers began to move through the crowd, their expressions serious as they scanned the faces of the guests. Jeffrey watched as they approached, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of months of planning and preparation. Patrick backed away from Jeffrey, his eyes darting between the approaching officers and the man who had once been his friend. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice laced with desperation. "You'll regret this, Jeffrey. I swear, you'll regret this." Jeffrey didn't flinch. He had no intention of letting Patrick's threats shake him. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to be swayed now. "It's already over, Patrick," he said quietly. "You just don't realize it yet." Patrick, his face pale, tried to regain his composure. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. His eyes darted from Jeffrey to the officers, seeking some semblance of normalcy, but found none. A tall officer with a sharp gaze stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the flashing lights. "Patrick Stevens?" he asked, his tone authoritative. "Yes." Patrick's response was weak, barely audible over the growing din. The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs and spoke with a practiced calm. "Patrick Stevens, you're under arrest. The charges include embezzlement, fraud, and other related crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patrick's face went slack as the words sank in. "You've got to be kidding me," he stammered, attempting to protest. "This is a mistake." The officer's expression remained unchanged as he moved to secure the cuffs around Patrick's wrists. "This is not a mistake," he said firmly. "We got evidence. You'll have your chance to explain yourself in court." Jeffrey stepped closer, his voice low but laced with satisfaction. "You didn't think I'd just let you get away with it, did you? All the thefts, the lies, the affair, none of it went unnoticed. I made sure the right people knew exactly what you were up to." Patrick's eyes widened in horror, his previous bravado replaced by a look of disbelief and fear. "You set me up," he spat, struggling against the restraints. Jeffrey shrugged, a cold smile on his lips. "I didn't set you up, Patrick. I simply made sure the authorities had what they needed to see the truth." The officers began to guide Patrick away from the garden, his protests growing more frantic. "Angela! Angela! Help me! Do something!" Angela, standing at the periphery of the scene, watched in shock. Her hands trembled at her sides, and tears streamed down her face as she took in the scene. Her world had shifted from one of comfortable deceit to a chaotic nightmare in a matter of moments. Jeffrey turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Angela, save your tears. You've made your bed, and now you have to lie in it." Angela's lips moved, but no words came out. Her eyes pleaded with Jeffrey, but he didn't waver. "Jeffrey," he cut her off with a raised hand. "No more excuses. The choices you made have consequences. This is your reality now." Patrick was finally escorted to the waiting police cars. He glanced back one last time, his face a mask of fear and desperation. The guests watched in stunned silence as he was loaded into the vehicle, the realization of the night's events settling heavily over them. As the police cars pulled away, Angela stood alone in the middle of the garden, her once secure life now shattered. The other guests began to drift away, their conversations filled with speculation and shock. The party that had once been filled with laughter and celebration was now a scene of quiet disarray. Jeffrey watched Angela from a distance, his mind made up. He had fought to get to this point, to expose the truth and see justice served. Now it was time to walk away. He turned and started to leave, but Angela's voice cut through the silence. "Jeffrey, wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "What is it, Angela?" I don't know what to do," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to face this." Jeffrey finally turned to look at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "You have to face it, Angela. This is the price of your choices." Angela looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly together, as if seeking some form of solace. "What about the kids?" she asked quietly. "How will I explain this to them?" Jeffrey's eyes narrowed. "That's something you'll have to figure out on your own. You're the one who made this mess. You're the one who has to clean it up." With that, Jeffrey took a deep breath and turned to leave. The night air was cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the confrontation. He walked away from the mansion, leaving behind the wreckage of his past and the echoes of betrayal that would linger long after the party had ended. As he made his way to his car, the reality of the evening's events settled in. The satisfaction of seeing Patrick face the consequences was tempered by the knowledge of the personal cost involved. But there was no going back now. The reckoning had come, and the fallout was just beginning. In the weeks following the party, life unraveled in ways that no one had anticipated. The once bustling suburban neighborhood, usually a haven of peace, became a backdrop for a series of dramatic events that captured the attention of both local and national media. The day after the arrest, Jeffrey woke to find his phone inundated with calls and messages. The media storm had begun. News outlets from all over the country were reporting on Patrick Stevens' fall from grace. Pictures of Patrick, handcuffed and looking defeated, appeared on every major news website and newspaper. The headlines were relentless. Corporate mogul arrested for massive fraud, affair exposed, the untold story, and from riches to rags, the Patrick Stevens scandal. Jeffrey watched the news reports with a detached interest. The satisfaction of seeing Patrick's empire crumble was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning of a long, painful process for everyone involved. He knew that Patrick's crimes were extensive: embezzlement, insider trading, and a slew of other financial misdeeds. The authorities had been investigating him for months, but it was Jeffrey's detailed tip-off and the evidence he had provided that had set the final pieces in motion. Patrick's fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. The authorities moved quickly to freeze his assets, seizing his properties, cars, and bank accounts. Patrick's once bustling business empire was reduced to a series of empty offices and boarded-up storefronts. His reputation, meticulously crafted over decades, was shredded in the span of days. It wasn't just his business that suffered. His personal life was in tatters. Jessica, his wife, filed for divorce immediately after the arrest. Their marriage, once a symbol of high society success, dissolved as quickly as Patrick's fortune. Jessica was seen in public only once, hurriedly gathering her belongings from their luxurious home. She was met by a swarm of reporters and photographers. "Jessica, how are you coping?" one reporter shouted. Jessica, her face pale and drawn, barely acknowledged them. "I have no comment," she said before quickly getting into a car that drove off into the distance. The scene was a stark contrast to the high-profile parties and social gatherings she had once frequented. For Angela, the fallout was just as severe. The day after the party, she found herself locked out of her office. Her boss, a colleague of Patrick's, informed her that her position was terminated due to her connection to the scandal. "I'm sorry, Angela, but we can't have any association with someone involved in such serious charges," he said, handing her a cardboard box filled with her personal items. Angela stood there stunned. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she managed to keep her composure. "I understand," she said quietly, though the words felt hollow. As the days turned into weeks, Angela's attempts to reach out to Jeffrey became increasingly desperate. She sent messages and left voicemails, pleading for a chance to explain, to beg for forgiveness. "Jeffrey, please, I know I messed up. I'm so sorry. Can we at least talk?" But Jeffrey remained resolute. He had no desire to revisit the past. Each time he saw her name pop up on his phone or heard her voice on a voicemail, he felt a pang of regret mixed with relief. He couldn't afford to be swayed by her pleas. The betrayal had cut too deep, and he had already made his decision. Jeffrey sold their home in the suburbs, a process that was both physically and emotionally draining. The house had been a symbol of a life that had once been filled with promise and happiness, but now it was merely a reminder of what had been lost. The sale went through quickly. The property was attractive, and the market was favorable. Jeffrey packed his belongings with a sense of finality, leaving behind the memories of a life that had been tainted by deceit. He relocated to a different city, far from the drama that had enveloped his old life. The new apartment was modest but comfortable. Jeffrey focused on rebuilding his life, finding solace in the simplicity of his new surroundings. He spent his days establishing a new routine, meeting new people, and finding new interests. The familiar echoes of his past were replaced by the quiet of a fresh start. Jeffrey found a small sense of peace in the knowledge that he had acted decisively, and that those who had wronged him had faced the consequences of their actions. He focused on living well on his own terms. The revenge he had sought was not just about punishing those who had wronged him. It was also about reclaiming his own sense of dignity and moving forward. As time passed, the media frenzy around Patrick Stevens gradually faded. The headlines shifted to other scandals and stories. Jeffrey watched from a distance, his involvement in the affair and its fallout becoming a distant echo in the background of his new life. One evening, as Jeffrey sat on his balcony, enjoying the calm of his new surroundings, he reflected on everything that had happened. The bitterness of betrayal had faded into a muted, distant memory. He had faced the storm head-on and emerged on the other side, scarred but resilient. Jeffrey's new life was far from perfect, but it was his own. He had learned that sometimes the best revenge is not about the dramatic gestures or public spectacle. Sometimes, it's about finding peace within yourself and moving forward, unburdened by the ghosts of the past. And as he looked out over the city skyline, Jeffrey felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had chosen to live well on his own terms.